How do I bind my quilt? I get asked that question quite a lot, so I've decided to do a little tutorial for you. I'm Karen from Fiddlesticks Fabrics, and hopefully by the end of this tutorial you'll know how to bind your quilt properly. So this quilt is about 200 inches all the way around, so it's about 44 by 50. So I need 5 strips at 40 inches, so that's strips cut with the fabric. I need 5 of those to make the binding. Now you can cut the binding at 2¼ inches, and that is just the perfect size. It leaves absolutely no room for no wiggle room, so I like to cut it at 2½ inches. So each of these strips is 2½ inches wide by the width of fabric, and that just gives you a little bit of an allowance in case you maybe don't go close enough to the edge, but it just gives you a little bit of wiggle room. So in order to bind a quilt, you want to make one continuous strip. So we join the strips together. Now we join them on the bias so that mitigates, we don't have a solid seam which is doubled over and then doubled over, which would be a very thick seam. So what we do is we sew this on a diagonal line. So we join our strips on the bias. Now you don't need to do bias binding for a straight quilt, but we do join them on the bias. So some people get mixed up and sew the wrong way. So you're trying to make a continuous strip. So you are going to put one strip right sides up, one strip right sides down, and then you're going to overlap them a little bit. So you have these little corners, and you're going to sew from this corner to this corner. How do I double check that if I'm not sure? Just put your thumb down, so that's the line you would stitch, and make sure that has made a continuous strip, and it has, so that is absolutely perfect. To remind you, when you take it to the sewing machine, put a little pin either side so these don't interfere with your sewing line, but it just reminds you that you're going to sew up the middle of these two. If you can't sew a straight line, or you find that a little tricky, draw your line on. So draw your line from the inside corner to the inside corner, and sew along that line. So I tend to pin everything before I take it to the sewing machine, just sew them all at once. So in order to add the next one, then we just bring this strip up, right sides up, and the next strip right sides down, and just do exactly the same thing again and again. If you need to check, yes, you have a continuous strip, and you'll eventually that'll eventually become normal for you, but just until you're 100% confident, then just double check that when you sew on the line that it makes a continuous strip again. So from there to there. So put all 5 strips together, take them to your sewing machine, sew them together, and then we'll go to the next stage. Now, these have been sewn, so take your pins out, and then you're going to trim this seam back to 1/4 inch. You can use your rotary cutter and ruler if you like, or you can just use your scissors. And then this is the only time really in quilting, unless it's a very complicated piece, that I would press my seams open. I tend to quilt in the ditch quite a bit, so I would never press my seams open normally, but for binding you always press your seams open and just go through each of the joins, trim to 1/4 inch, press your seam open, there we go. Now, when you have that done, take this to the ironing board, and this continuous strip is all going to be pressed together, so wrong sides together, and we're going to fold this over, and then this makes a really secure, safe binding that will last for a long time. This is called double binding. So take this to your ironing board, press this in half, and then I'm going to show you how to put this onto your quilt. Okay, now that that's been pressed, we're going to put the binding onto the side of the quilt. So obviously you sew it raw edges to raw edges, and you sew the binding onto the front of the quilt, then it will wrap around to the back. So first of all, you leave about a 6 or 8 inch strip free, because you need a little bit of wiggle room for joining, and then use some binding clips and just bind. I tend not to go much more than about 15 inches ahead of myself, and just clip down into the corner. Now when we get to the corner, we're going to stop just 1/4 inch from the edge, and I tend to mark that because sometimes you can't see. Just checking you can see. Sometimes you can't see here, and so I put just a pin just to mark it so it's sticking out the side. I put a pin in there, and then I know to stop there, and then I make a little turn and sew off onto the very corner, and that gives a lovely little miter that just secures your miter for you. So we'll take this to the sewing machine and we'll be back in a sec. Okay, so I've sewed, I've left a strip of about 8 inches. I've sewed with 1/4 inch seam down here. Now I tend to use my walk-in foot for this because then it stops anything from bunching up. If you don't have a walk-in foot, put your stitch size up to about 3.5 or 4 and stitch on. Use your 1/4 inch foot even, stitch on with a 1/4 inch. And then it's maybe quite tricky to see this, but what I have done here is I have sewn down my 1/4 inch seam, and then I have stopped here at the 1/4 inch mark, and I have sewn diagonally to the point. And I find that that makes for a lovely miter. So to turn the corner, we're going to turn the quilt so that our binding is coming along here, and then we lift the binding up so that we get a lovely 45-degree angle here, and then we're going to bring that right back down here. So you're not looking to make a bubble or anything here, you're just a lovely 90-degree angle, and then you're going to start to sew here and sew right along the edge. So with your binding clips again, go ahead and sew right through. All the corners are done the same, and you're going to sew your binding on and you're going to go through all 4 corners, and you are going to stop. So you've got a tail here, you're going to stop about here, so you're going to leave a tail and about 8 inches in between those, and that gives you plenty of wiggle room for joining the strips, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Now this is the part where we're going to join the binding, and this is the part that people have a little bit of trouble with. I take a little shortcut in that there's always excess binding, and I chop a little bit off because we're going to overlap these 2 pieces by the width of the binding. All right, so instead of having to measure and fiddle about with rulers and things like that, we have a piece of binding here. We're just going to use the width, and we have a center point on this. So if we were to decide that the center point, the point at which these are going to join, is going to be here, so then we can trim this piece down. All right, and then with everything laid flat, we're going to overlay this piece so that they will overlay each other here, okay, just by the width of the binding. And we are going to chop this one off here. All right, so everything's cut to size, and then we just have to sew it. So for that, I'm going to turn this around just to prepare it. All right, so if we have this piece coming in, we're going to open that up, all right, which is why you want this big opening here, because that gives you plenty of wiggle room. All right, so that's right side up, and the one that's coming in from the right hand side is going to be right hand down, and they're going to overlay each other. We're going to sew them together on the diagonal or on the bias like we did with the other ones. If I could find a wee pin. So we are going to pin that side there and this side here, and just similar to what we've done, sewing the strips together from the start, then we are now going to, so you see if you fold this up and take the weight off the quilt, you have a lovely little piece here, and you are going to sew from here to here. All right, so it's a little bit trickier because it wants to pull away, but that you're going to sew that, and then I'm going to show you how that fits perfectly. Okay, so we take our pins out, and I always just like to double check just in case I had a wee brain fart. So everything's fine. That's going to lay beautifully flat. All right. So before I do that, I'm going to trim this down to 1/4 inch seam and press the seam open, just like the others. And then I'm going to show you how we roll it to the other side and hand stitch it to the back. Be back in a sec. Okay, now the binding is on and it's nicely secure. It turned out perfectly. It was very tight. And then we're just going to use our binding clips. So this is the back of the quilt. We're just going to use our binding clips. And I only ever bind maybe a couple of clips ahead of myself. I do like to bind the corner. So, and all you do with the corner is you let that run all the way out, and then you fold this little bit in, and then you've got a lovely mitered corner. So you've got the miter in the front because you sewed off into the corner, and then you have the miter, you just make the miter on the back and pop a clip in that. All right, and then it's a very, very simple stitch. I tend to use like a number 8 embroidery needle for nearly everything these days, and that's mostly an eyesight issue. I can't really thread anything else. So just put a knot, this is what we call a quilter's knot. So just put a knot in the end of your thread, and then don't forget that everything that goes into the binding, none of that's going to be seen. And also the important thing is you don't want your thread, I've just done it myself, so you don't want your thread to be too long because it becomes quite unruly. So never let your thread be any longer than from the tips of your fingers to your elbow. And then you're going to start with just put a little double stitch up within the sewing line. All right, so a little double stitch, and you're going to come out literally just a couple of threads in the edge of the binding. All right, so this gets you started, and then your movement from here on in is just go in directly beneath that. You're going to push your needle through the layers, and you can take a decent sized stitch, about between 1/8 and 1/4 inch, and come out again just a couple of threads into the binding. So look, we're going in just directly underneath, we're taking a decent sized stitch, and we're coming out at the very edge of the binding, just catching a couple of threads. All right, so this is a reasonably quick and easy stitch, and you can just put on a movie or a box set and curl up on the sofa, and this is your excuse to veg out in front of the TV. And it really doesn't take that long. And I know some of you are going to say, oh, you don't want to have to hand stitch the back, but it's not that difficult, and it looks so much better than any of the alternatives. So please give it a try. This is Karen from Fiddlesticks Fabrics. I hope you've enjoyed. Take care. Good night.